Class number 6, further phase of regime transformation and consolidation in new independent states. Last time, as you remember, we discussed initial phase of regime transformation and consolidation. And this initial phase took from several months to several years in different countries. And the main factors that influenced the initial stage were experience accumulation and threats to inherited segment stateness. Of course, this already at that stage, this provided, as we have discussed, a great variety of options for development. For example, we stated that in a number of cases, they went through a very difficult and protracted period of crisis development, for example, in some of Caucasian states, or in the territories with problematic sovereign status. While in some other cases, this first phase was fairly smooth. Of course, developments during the first phase significantly influenced the further stage. This time we'll do the same as we did at the previous class. We'll go case by case, region by region. So we start from Northern Eurasia, and there are two cases, as you remember, Russia and Chechnya. In case of Russia, the first phase took all the 90s. It was a period of Yeltsin regime, and this period definitely falls into two parts. Prior to 93, when a new constitution was adopted, and then after 93. Already in the second half of this phase, after elections of electoral cycle of 95-96, it became clearly evident that certain consolidation of regime is already going on, but also it became evident that further transformation of regime is in a sense inevitable. One of the reasons for that were the very dramatic character of changes, the structural and systemic degradation which we discussed at our previous meetings reached its utmost in Russia with the default of 98, and Yeltsin regime reacting to default had to make certain compromise decisions. It was a period of attempts to pragmatically play down effects of default, and pragmatically to play down certain effects of radical economic and political transformation of the previous period. And those attempts are linked with the activities of Prime Minister Primakov at that period. He was trying to compensate for some of the too radical changes of the previous years. But of course, this period of Primakov was fairly short-lived, for about a year, And on the other hand, this didn't lead to regime change anyway. This was only a minor development within the regime, but it clearly signified that certain regime transformations are necessary. And regime transformations actually took place with in the period of the next president of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. It's quite interesting that the transition from one regime to the other was fairly smooth, well prepared. It was Yeltsin himself who first appointed his successor prime minister, and then resigned quite unexpectedly for many observers and for many citizens, just a few months before it was possible actually for him to resign, and a new presidential campaign started with the new contender, with the successor appointed by the previous president. And this successor naturally won because Vladimir Putin used quite effectively the period of his stay, of his being prime minister. He demonstrated probably even in a more visible way this pragmatic nature of his rule, of his approach to political issues. He was ready for fairly broad range of compromises with all kinds of political forces, and this actually helped him to create some initial starting support for his presidency at the beginning. Of course, being a newcomer, being quite an unexpected figure, this also handicapped his activities in a sense, but also it gave him certain advantages because he was able to act in a much more flexible way in establishing contacts with various political forces, politicians, and so on and so forth, and proposing new policy agenda. Of course, the new policy agenda was very much linked to Chechenian issue, and here probably we'll look back on the case of Chechnya. As I told you, Chechnya was one of the 8 cases that we consider in the area when there were attempts to create an independent stateness. You remember that at the last class it has been mentioned that Chechenian case was a very exceptional one. It was very typical of all the attempts of state building in post-Soviet period to rely very heavily on the Soviet legacy. Actually, all the new independent states were successors of Soviet republics, and many of them, as you remember, actually used the Soviet constitutions for the first 2, 3, 4 years independent. In each case, it was different. Sometimes it was a shorter period, sometimes it was a longer period. That actually, in the initial period of from 1 to 2, 3 years, they were using the old Soviet constitution of Soviet republics. And even when new constitutions were developed, also this legacy was very visible. Same is true of some of the territories with problematic status, particularly those territories where they had some kind of segment status under Soviet Union. For example, this is true of Karabakh, this is true of Abkhazia, this is true of Southern Ossetia and Adjaria. Well, this is not true of two cases in Moldova, Transnistria and Gagauzia, but we'll come later to those cases. And this is definitely not true of Chechnya, because in Chechnya, the first thing which they did, even in the period of initial transition, they actually splitted the Soviet Republic of Chechen-Ingush Autonomous Republic into two republics. Ingush Republic that was established, part of this republic, somehow could have claimed being a successor, while in the Chechenian part they definitely rejected this Soviet legacy, and actually the base for their existence was a traditional one, not a constitutional one. This is also quite important, that from the very beginning they were relying on tribal customs, they were relying on Islamic legal tradition, and on some other sources of legitimation of the new regime that emerged, not the formal structures as it was typical in all other cases. In Chechnya, they had a Congress of Chechenian People, which actually constituted then, at some stage, new Republic of Ichkeria. But this Congress of Chechenian People was a kind of political and social movement. But even this description as political and social movement is a bit of exaggeration. It's a conceptual distortion in a sense, because this was rather a combination of traditional tribal structures that were framed to look like a social movement because of the circumstances very favorable for development of social movements during the transition period. So from this point of view, Chechenian Republic, or Republic of Ichkeria as they called it, was a fairly dramatic departure from experience of other state building projects. It was I wouldn't say it was something like an anti-modernist project, but definitely it contradicted in many aspects the traditions of modernization. It was definitely a reaction against a reactionary, if you wish, to venture fairly dubious from the point of view of modernization processes and state building as we know it in Western Europe, for example, or other parts of the world. This was also a reason why very soon the issue of terrorism and issue of uncontrolled violence, or controlled violence but controlled not in an expected state monopoly nature, but rather controlled by this network of tribal authorities, very soon developed. And Chechnya became a fairly big issue of export of terrorism, particularly in the southern part and Caucasian part of Russia, as well as a locus of export of this non-modern political practices of traditional nature, which actually influenced some other republics, some other areas of Russia, and not only of Russia. During Yeltsin period, there was a war. There was an attempt to suppress it in a very simplistic way, as it was typical of Yeltsin's regime. Doing something very straightforward, doing something very simple and outright. So there was an attempt to resolve this issue by simply playing down the regime. But this first war actually failed. And Russia had to make certain compromise to have this case of half recognition of Chechnya. Chechnya, after the Khosavurt agreements, Chechnya was recognized as a partner, as an actually existing authority structure in Northern Caucasus, but it hasn't got the formal status of foreign state, so to say. So that created a very dubious situation, very unclear situation, and definitely it wasn't a solution. It was quite clear that the problem would have to be resolved in some way. Of course, it was possible to grant Chechnya full recognition at some stage, but this should be a clear condition for that was a proper development of state structure and statehood project that could be acceptable both to Russia and the international community. But I'm afraid that it was quite clear that the kind of state-building project that Chechenian leadership was trying to develop was the one that wouldn't suit even the minimal requirements either of New Russia or international community. And besides, there were pragmatic aspects, because the Chechenian territory became the locus of export of all kinds of problems, not only terrorism, but also drug trafficking, illegal trade, and even you know, they have developed well, kind of slavery practices. They were kidnapping people and making them slaves, or doing some other things. So it was quite a serious situation. So for Yeltsin regime, it was quite evident that something had to be done. This was actually the high priority of the issue in the agenda was actually increased by the fact that certain fairly tragic terrorist acts have been committed in '99, and one of the first actions undertaken by Putin, first as prime minister and then as the president, were launching of a new counter-terrorist attack, counter-terrorist operation, as it was termed then. But in actual fact, already during his presidency, it was a fairly consistent and well-prepared and well-planned war, so-called Second Chechen War. The Second Chechen War had its own dynamics. We wouldn't go into details how the war developed, but it was at some stage when there were certain successes in pulling down the activities of rebel have been achieved. The Putin regime tried to undertake significant political, economical, and other measures to restore order in the area, and they were quite successful. Because it was possible to create some, say, initial coalition of political forces in Chechnya itself, of the people who were interested in stopping the war. It was Kadyrov, the older Kadyrov, who became a leader of this coalition. And this coalition gradually, month by month, year by year, was expanding. And by the time Kadyrov was assassinated and Alkhanov substituted him as acting as the president, very significant development of this peace coalition has been achieved. And this was a period of decisive change in Chechnya. Well, by this time, actually in Chechnya, the progress is quite significant. The new constitution. Well, first of all, there are formal things that has been done. The formal and fairly adequate in legal and constitutional terms structures have been established, including adoption of constitution that has been legitimized by referendum, elections of president, of legislature, and so on and so forth also have taken place. And I must say that all those elections and adoption of constitution and other issues were taken quite seriously, both by the leadership, the Chechenian leadership, and many people supporting this coalition. So this already created a very positive change in the area. But what is more important, the very regime that has been established, regime of younger Kadyrov, because at a certain stage the Alo Khanov resigned, and younger Kadyrov, the son of the head of this initial peace coalition, actually substituted him. So now they are trying to develop a fairly liberal regime. Of course, when I'm using this word liberal, you have to understand that it is liberal both in Russian and Chechenian terms. So it's a kind of regime which is exceptionally pragmatic and quite open to respect and recognize interests of all or most of the people they deal with. Of course, not the rebels that still are there, but these terrorist activities and rebel activities actually are now not very significant. They're really very, very marginal, and actually some kind of resistance still continues there, but mainly it is based on outside support. And the level of terrorism is probably not higher than in some other parts of Russia. For example, Dagestan. In Dagestan, it's neighboring republic. Level of terrorism is actually probably higher even than in present-day Chechnya. But coming back to the nature of regime, it is very pragmatic. It tries to satisfy as many people as possible, but on the other hand, it's trying to stay within certain legal frames, certain constitutional frames. Doing both things are being done fairly informally. You have to understand that actually people that are running the business there, and actually the federal forces, in practical terms, have withdrawn. Well, there's some control of federal authorities, and there are some federal forces there, but most of the things are actually run by Chechenians themselves. And you have to recognize that the people who are actually doing the business, who are actually undertaking this statehood process, are the kind of people that lived through the war, that have this very specific traditional mentality of Chechenian people that, for example, the previous regime relied upon when they were claiming to establish new and many other things, including, for example, strong links of many commanders or participants with the previous rebel forces or some outlaw structures and so on and so forth. So when I'm saying liberal, you have to understand that this is not a neat, nice Western European liberalism, but something very pragmatic. People who actually are very informal and could be under different conditions quite cruel, and they're trying to behave decently as much as they could. But well, for example, I have quite a number of friends who are human rights activists, and they visited Chechnya for several times. And from their personal reports, I can learn that the level of freedom, so to say, the ability of people to organize or to do something, to undertake some practical activity is quite high there. But even they claim, I really cannot say that for sure, but they claim that it's even higher than in most other parts of Russia at this moment. But of course, you should understand also that the situation there is also far from simple. There are still continuing threats of violence, and there's an ongoing violence in various forms, not only in forms of terrorist attacks, but in many other forms. But things are gradually getting to something which one can say normal. And what is particularly important is that the present day segment stateness of Chechnya, because now Chechnya is, according to terminology that we are using in our course, is not a proper statement, it's segment statement. So the project of state building has been reduced to state building on the level of segment stateness.
Like all the other states in all the other republics in Russia, or does it have still some special status?
Yes. Actually, and it's good that you asked this question. Yes, all the other republics in Russia, they have their own segment status, and even during the heyday of Russian federalism under Yeltsin regime, particularly in the first half of the 90s, most of Russian regions also managed to develop some kind of segment stateness. They developed their own not constitutions, but what they call charters. They developed their legislatures. Well, there were presidential elections in most of the areas, and so on and so forth. So present-day Russian Federation is actually a federation of segment states, formally at least. Now we'll discuss changes in Russian Federation and the structure of Russian Federation and federal policies under Putin, and then I'll tell you more about what happened then and how Russian Federation looks like now at this moment. So to to finish the Chechenian issue, what we can claim is that the project of state building, which was a non-modern, traditional project, has actually failed. and it has been substituted by a modernistic project of segment stateness, which seems, at least until now, to be quite successful. When I'm saying seems to be quite successful, I mean that significant progress has been reached, and a certain degree of normalization has been reached. But of course, developments in Chechnya, normalization in Chechnya is not yet complete. Probably a few years more would be necessary to actually stabilize situation to the level that we would be able to say that there are no problems with segment stateness there. But the progress is quite visible. So from this point of view, we can close down one of the abortive cases of state building and see that there was competition between two approaches, and lucky enough, the modernistic approach actually one prevailed. Now coming to Balto-Euxinic system. As for the states that developed out of union republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, you remember that they all developed new constitutions quite quickly. Actually, already during the Soviet period, there were taken steps to accelerate this process. Very quickly, newly elected legislatures of all the republics have restored the previous constitutions of the countries which existed in the interwar period and legitimized them. And which is more important, they did it in a very consistent way and legally, very correctly and consistently, which enabled them to develop those new constitutions. Of course, there emerged some other problems which we mentioned there, but at least from the point of view of constitutionality, it was quite an achievement. So all the further developments actually had to take place within the framework of regime change. And for Baltic states, this regime change could be associated with their entrance into EU. To join EU, they had to undertake significant changes, not only in their national legislature on many legislation on many important issues, but they also had to change the practices they are using. Of course, this didn't solve major contradictory issues. For example, an issue of Russian-speaking minority in Estonia and Latvia, particularly. But the change of regime actually created a more pragmatic base for treating this issue as well as a number of other issues. What is even more important, I wouldn't go into details, just give you a general evaluation. What is more important is a general shift from confrontation type of politics. Of course, they were, even in the first period, during the first phase of regime consolidation, there were attempts to consolidate regime and so on and so forth. So it wasn't outright confrontation anyway, but there were elements of confrontation, and there were quite significant degree of exclusion, particularly of Russian-speaking minority, but not only. This politics of confrontation and exclusion was part of consolidation at the first period. while some remnants of this tradition also continued during the second phase, during the further phase of consolidation. For example, the exclusion still is there, but this exclusion is of a much more milder nature. In a sense, it's not directly associated by regime itself with an outright confrontation and so on and so forth, more flexible. And there exists a general understanding within regime that even those sectors of political system that were excluded during the initial phase, while continuing being excluded, they have to be reintegrated in some form into the structure. And this is very important. This is linked, as I mentioned, with the joining of bigger Europe and adoption of certain norms and standards of European behavior, of European politics. But I think this also very well corresponds, translates to internal dynamics, internal regime dynamics. So it was quite evident, even during the first phase, the initial phase of consolidation of regimes in Baltic states, that some type of normalization stage has to be achieved, and definitely this European integration helped quite a lot, in my understanding. Lithuania, in this regard, stands somewhat apart. I would rather say that in Lithuanian case, probably this tendency is somewhat different. While with Brazauskas' domination, when Brazauskas was prime minister and president and prime minister again in Lithuania, this old communist leader who actually became very, very pinkish social democrat, and even probably for a social democrat he was still questionable, very liberal kind of regime, but still relying on quite heavily relying on legacies, on traditions, all kinds of traditions, not only communist and not so much communist and Soviet traditions, but all kinds of traditions. He was a traditionalist. Traditionalist regime. Regime was at the initial phase fairly consolidated. With the transition to the further stage, actually some of the contradictions and conflicts that were played down during this period, they came into the open. Of course, there were some subjective reasons for heightening tensions there in Lithuania, but this further stage of Lithuanian regime consolidation is characterized by a more clearly expressed conflict patterns developing there. Now coming to Belarusia. In Belarusia, fairly soon, the previous transition regime, the initial phase, was substituted by a new phase. In 94, as you remember, we discussed it, new constitution was adopted and a new president was elected, Lukashenko. And in a couple of years, already he amended the constitution, and from 96, in a fairly definite way, we have a case of consolidation of a very specific type of regime. Most of the people in the West characterize this regime as authoritarian. I think that this is a very simplistic characteristics of regime. Of course, it is authoritarian, but you cannot explained by this fairly simple instrument, conceptual instrument, the nature of this this regime. In fact, I think that it would be far more correct to say that it's traditionalist plebiscitarian regime. Of course, the rule of the role of the leader, Lukashenko himself, is quite important. But even if we imagine that Lukashenko disappears, by some miracle, yeah, I don't think that immediately there would be collapse of this regime, because too many people are actually interested into consolidating a stable order, which somehow rests on maintaining traditional values, traditional attitudes, and traditional patterns of behavior. Of course, there exists opposition, and this opposition is growing. And the more repression is being taken against this opposition, the more a regime is being eroded. And of course, quite a lot of things are happening in Belarus, which could make it possible a change of regime. But the main source of strength of this regime is not so much existence of a leader with the repressive apparatus and structures and so on and so forth, which is typical of authoritarian regime, but rather this demand from below for stable traditional order. And not just for any kind of stable traditional order, but stable traditional order which people were enjoying during the Soviet period. Paternalistic, but on the other hand, fairly liberal, not in political terms, in social terms, liberal and social terms, giving fairly large space to all kind of everyday activities of people, and so on and so forth. This stage, which started in mid-90s, is still going on. This further stage of consolidation of Belarusian regime, and even with a number of crises that emerged linked to electoral campaigns, particularly the last presidential campaign that was there in Belarus. They all have a fairly superfluous nature, all those crises. Still, the base of regime, so to say, is quite solid. But as I said, this cannot continue for too long, and probably in a few years we'll observe some changes there as well. Now coming to Ukraine, it's the most interesting case probably. In Ukraine, we have a fairly extended initial phase of regime consolidation. The regime of Kuchma, which was quite successful in terms of compromise making between different social forces, was actually a continuation of the initial phase of regime. Transition from the rule of Kravchuk to rule of Kuchma was, first of all, was very smooth, despite of some personal and subjective conflicts that emerged during this transition, linked to electoral campaigns and so on and so forth. But otherwise, it was quite smooth, and the logic of regime was the same. So we can actually say that both regime of Kravchuk and Kuchma belonged to this first initial phase. This was quite long and continued till the so-called the so-called Orange Revolution. And what we're observing now is not a new regime, I'm sorry to say, but which is a crisis, a transition crisis. Transition from first regime to the second regime. Of course, there were signs, there were indications, particularly in the period when there was, on the one hand, rivalry, but on the other hand, cooperation between presidency and president and prime minister. Very short-lived period, which was an indication of a possible framework for consolidation of the further stage for the further stage of regime consolidation. That this could be a kind of institutional formula of arrested rivalry, so to say. But otherwise, we are still observing there a period of transition that doesn't allow us to claim that any kind of a new regime is being consolidated, which is actually also true of other color revolutions, and we'll discuss color revolutions a bit later during our next class, probably. As for other countries, Moldova is quite an important case, and probably is particularly interesting case because the initial phase of consolidation of Moldovan regime continued till the end of 90s. We discussed already the nature of this regime and its relations with the two alternative state-building projects in Transnistria and Gagauzia. We also, as you remember, mentioned that Gagauzian issue was successfully resolved, and now there exists a segment stateness of Gagauzia within Moldova, so this was also an abortive case of state building, and fairly smooth transition from full-fledged state building project into segment state building project. For Gagauzians themselves, I think this was a fairly adequate and happy solution. As well as for Moldovan state as such, which we cannot say about Transnistrian issue, which is still a locus of tension. And this Transnistrian issue also continued to be quite important during the second phase of regime consolidation. The further stage of regime consolidation is linked to elections of Piotr Luchinsky as president of Moldova, but it's not only his figure, his personality that influenced the further stage of regime consolidation, although he's quite an impressive personality. What is actually important is the formal, also important is formal side of the issue, and this is a transition of the state system into a parliamentary republic. So now we're having a very strange combination. Regime is characterized by a very strange combination of parliamentary system with strong presidency. And this is a specific feature of the second Moldovan Republic. I would call it even this way. It's not only a change of regime, but we also had some changes in constitutional setup, and we can properly speak about second Moldovan Republic, which is also a very interesting experiment from the point of view of constitutional design, institutional design, and so far it is developing quite positively. Of course, in Moldova there are still ongoing issues related to economic recovery, to social issues, demographic issues, and so on and so forth. But politically wise, I think that they have reached a stage of fairly sound compromise. And this compromise makes the whole political system manageable, predictable, but this is not a kind of authoritarian management or imposed management or informal prediction. This prediction is due to compromise that has been reached there, which leaves quite a big room for individual political forces, individual political leaders to undertake their own initiatives, to propose policy options, and so on and so forth. Of course, the situation is not as rosy as I mentioned. Of course, there are significant problems. Some of the problems are related to, so to say, what I would call, it's a general problem for most of post-Soviet states. The quality of politicians and citizenry. Okay, institutionally and on the level of political compromise, of course, significant achievement has been reached. But how people are using those possibilities that emerge there, and here one can be a bit disillusioned because the level of practical management, both at the top and on the level of citizens, the activities of the citizens is fairly simplistic, is far from being adequate to present day standards of democracy. To say nothing of continuing domination of one-party domination in Moldovan politics. It's a Communist Party of Moldova that dominates the whole thing. But you could also understand, you should also understand that Communist Party of Moldova is very far from, say, Communist Party of USSR or anything. It's not an ideological party. It's a very big, pragmatic party of traditionalists. There exist many political sectors, many political interests within the party. Actually, most of the social forces that exist in Moldova, they are either directly represented within the party or they have some link within the party. So party itself is kind of a pluralist forum for rivalry of various projects, approaches, and so on and so forth. But being this very uncertain and very pluralistic structure, it is, on the other hand, being a structure that is dominated by a single leader, President Voronin, who at his own will can manipulate different pluralistic forces that are existing there. So the situation itself is fairly uneasy and contradictory. But with all its contradictions, I think that achievements, both institutional achievements and practical achievements of pragmatic everyday politics in Moldova are quite visible. Quite visible. One of the factors that helped to achieve that progress in Moldova were also a politics of exclusion, the same way as it happened in Baltic republics, where exclusion of Russian-speaking population from the polity itself helped to consolidate the polity. The same way, exclusion of Transnistria and Gagauzia for a period of time from Moldovan politics actually helped to consolidate this Moldovan politics. And continuing exclusion of Transnistria is actually a factor that positively influences internal Moldovan politics. It's a statement which may sound fairly contradictory to what Moldovan politicians are claiming officially in their statements and so on and so forth. But I deeply believe that this is true, and I have some evidence. I've been this year to Moldova and made some field research there, which proves this claim. Of course, from the point of view of fundamental interests of Moldovan people as well as population of Transnistria, from this point of view, a reintegration of Transnistria into Moldova is vitally important. But this is probably a very distant perspective, fairly distant perspective, because for the time being, both present-day Moldovan polity needs exclusion of Transnistria, and Transnistrian politicians also exploit their exclusion from Moldova to consolidate political rule. And both sides are actually interested in continuation of the conflict from this point of view. They are interested to continue the conflict, to continue the split, to maintain the split. In the long run, of course, they would be necessary to overcome it, but they can postpone for the time being this. There's another problem. Many people whom I met in Moldova and Transnistria, because I've been to both parts, they claim that there are immediate economic, social, whatever interests within the leadership of both Moldova and Transnistria to maintain this situation of the split, which probably may be true. But from my point of view, even more important is this structural demand. Because if, for example, this reintegration would take place next day, next month, or next year, this would immediately destabilize political situation in both parts and destabilize it radically. They had to renegotiate all kind of agreements which they have reached already and with which they are quite happy for the time being. So that would be a fairly big crisis. Well, in my understanding, it's worthwhile trying to reach this compromise, but you also have to take into consideration that it's quite risky, and people are not inclined, probably. The actual people who are running the business there are not in a position to risk their achievements, which are quite visible. Well, as for Transnistria, situation is even more stable there, and in my understanding, much worse, because they were having a very simplistic authoritarian regime, basing itself upon Soviet legacy and so on and so forth. Something like an exaggerated Belarusia. But still, because Transnistria is quite small, destabilization may come much quicker than in Belarus. Belarus is a fairly big country. So this base for maintaining traditionalist regime is quite strong there. In Transnistria, situation is very similar in many ways, but since the country is very small, it can be destabilized fairly quickly. Even some small thing like a crisis during elections may provoke significant problems there. So they are quite vulnerable to this type of things, and that's why probably authorities of Transnistria are particularly keen in avoiding possible crisis developments there. Coming to Transcaucasia. Here, the situation in all the three post-Soviet states was quite different. As you remember, the first very short period of regime consolidation was characterized by attempts to radically develop a new regime which would dramatically depart from Soviet legal tradition. Although, of course, the territorial issue or the composition of Georgia was treated in terms of this legal tradition, but so to say constitutionally, they were trying to make a radical departure. The first president of Georgia, Gamsakhourdia, and political forces around him actually tried to do the same as people did in Baltic states. They insisted that the constitution of Georgian Republic of Constitution of 1920 was restored, but the difference was that they didn't even bother to make adequate legal actions to help to restore this. It was only claimed that constitution is being restored, but no practical legal steps were taken to develop a proper base for law and order, and the regime was fairly quickly destabilized. Actually, already in this first period of transition, under the Soviet Union still existed, but Gamsakhourdia regime already went into crisis. So it was a very short-lived attempt. Shevardnadze, who replaced Gamsakhourdia after fairly dramatic events, actually a kind of a civil war in the capital of Georgia for a couple of weeks. There were direct clashes between military groups of militants on both sides. Shevardnadze's regime lasted for quite a long period of time, and he managed to consolidate kind of a compromise regime. But as I told you at our last class, actually Shevardnadze regime we can consider as the initial stage of regime consolidation, and now we're having a situation very similar to that of Ukraine, when we have another color revolution, and instead of developing consolidating a new regime, we are actually still observing a period of crisis. The present presidential campaign and the crisis that we observed at the beginning of November only proves this. Of course, this we cannot exclude the possibility that despite of all these problems, Saakashvili would win presidential elections and probably would be able to consolidate regime, but it's quite evident that now it's a very unclear situation. We cannot say for sure that a new regime is already there. Everything depends on how things would develop. Fairly similar developments were characteristic of Azerbaijan, with the only exception that this first turbulent phase of pre-regime dynamics was more extended. In Azerbaijan, the things were not settled till '92. And actually, during this first period, the most decisive events in Karabakh has taken place. After '92 and the dismissal of the president, actually a coup that when President Elchibey was forced to go in. To leave Baku and to flee into Nakhichevan. A new regime has been consolidated, by led and directed by President Aliyev. Although now Ilham Aliyev, his son, succeeded Gaydar Aliyev, I would say that we do not have any significant, any visible regime change. So from this point of view, Azerbaijan is probably at the initial phase of regime consolidation. It's a very protracted period of regime consolidation. And same may be true also of some of the Central Asian regimes. For example, Uzbek case or Turkmenistan case. It's very similar developments in general terms. Of course, there are differences in particulars, in dynamics. For example, Uzbek regime has been very dynamic during this period, but with all its there were several shifts and changes of political agenda within the regime during this period, but this didn't cause the change of regime itself. It is also important to not to forget about state building projects in territories with problematic status. And Transcaucasia is actually rich with those projects. Karabakh is probably the most advanced case in my understanding. As I mentioned to you, there was fairly early during the war, already about 92-93, there was a visible regime transformation there, the regime of the war regime, so to say, regime where the pragmatics of war were prevailing, has been substituted by a regime of peaceful consolidation, and in terms of internal developments in this country, the people have achieved the most significant progress. The most elaborate political institutions have developed there, quite effective in terms of regular elections, in terms of relations between different bodies, and so on and so forth. And when I've been at the beginning of this year, both in Armenia and Karabakh, and talked to people there, I find clear evidence that Karabakh politicians consider their institutions, their democratic order, as their main resource for survival. The continuation of state building in this part of the world dramatically depends on quality of institutions. Why it is so? The answer is quite evident. Formally, the war is still there. There's only an armistice, kind of armistice. If actually it can stop any moment, any day. So people in Karabakh, on the one hand, they want to avoid war as much as possible at any costs, and they want to provide an alternative base for their state building project. But their state building project is vulnerable not only because of the war. It's also vulnerable because of the support from Armenia. Because in both countries there are living Armenians, the same population. Actually, Azeris have actually left the country. When I was meeting the head of the State Statistics Committee, he produced us. He gave us results of the last census, and the first thing which I did, I said, "Please, let's look how many Azeris are there living in Karabakh." So no problem. Look, 6 people. 6. Oh, interesting. Who are they? Members of the families. Members of the families who couldn't leave. So all other Azeris, 100%, actually left the country. So only Armenians are living there, and support from Armenia is actually a big problem, because this support legitimizes, in a sense, the state building project in Karabakh. During my expedition to Armenia and Karabakh, me and my colleague Ильина, she was with me, we made a number of interviews with the politicians and citizens in the street, and it's interesting how they reacted differently to a question which we asked both in Armenia and in Karabakh. We were asking a question: what if by some miracle the situation would be normalized to a stage when you could simply decide without any outside pressure on the future of Karabakh? What do you think would be the decision? Karabakh to join Armenia, Karabakh to establish some kind of relations with Armenia, to develop some segment stateness within Armenia, or Karabakh to maintain as absolutely independent, separate state from Armenia. In Armenia, reactions were, of course, joy. Some two politicians, probably more advanced politicians than the general level, they said probably segment stateness could work. But otherwise, everybody was saying just to join. In Karabakh, it's interesting. Even politicians who are very, so to say, pro-Armenian and very much not opposition politicians, everybody were saying some kind of segment stateness, and most of other people were just saying independent. And to be independent, a few people, without even asking a specific question, it was their, so to say, evaluation. They were saying, to be independent, or to ensure our survival, using different words, to ensure our survival, we have to be ahead of Armenians in terms of democratic practices. We should have better democracy here in Karabakh than in Armenia. That's the only source for our survival, for our distinctiveness. We have to be ahead of them. So probably this is the reason why they're paying so much attention to institution building and developing of democratic practices and so on and so forth. Coming back to Abkhazia and South Ossetian issue, because Adjarian issue has been actually, we wouldn't be discussing it at all, because it is a very specific state building project, and it is already an abortive case. As for Abkhazia and South Ossetia, we are having a situation in many ways very similar to Transnistria. Very similar to Transnistria. The exclusion that we are observing there is actually helping to consolidate polities on both sides. But also there are minor differences there. While in South Ossetia, we are still having the initial phase of regime consolidation. It seems that in Abkhazia, with the stepping down of President Ardzinba and presidential campaign that elapsed, we are having transition to a new regime, to further stage of regime consolidation. Of course, this transition was in many ways quite helpful in terms of institution buildings, but even this further stage of regime consolidation in practical terms is far from developing a stable state structure there. Here situation is still this Abkhazian state is still very vulnerable to both outside and inside, and it would need much more time to develop more viable state structures. Yeah. Central Asia. here we also have two very interesting and deviant cases of Tajikistan, where we had a long period of civil war, and then a consolidation of Rahimov, and then a consolidation of regime after that, a secular regime of Rachmanov. This regime is still in the initial phase of consolidation, while somewhat mirror developments took place in Kyrgyzstan, where at a very smoothly the first initial stage of regime consolidation under Akayev has been achieved, and there was very easy transition from Soviet period to post-Soviet period. But then we are observing there the Tulip Revolution, which again is far from finishing. Far from finishing. All the three color revolutions are still the continuing phases of regime destabilization. This is also true of Kyrgyzia, and what is also true, but this we'll discuss at our next class, what is also true is that all the three cases are quite different in terms of their political dynamics, in terms of their social, economic, and political meaning, and so on and so forth. Although we can put them together into one class of color revolutions, they are all phenomena of fairly different nature. And it would be, from the point of view of political scientists, it would be an exaggeration to claim that they all follow more or less the same pattern or have the same logic. The logics and patterns are quite different. The only common thing with all the color revolutions is that they are periods of protracted regime destabilization without entering into a phase of regime consolidation. That's all. Another exceptional case, not only geographically, Kazakhstan, as you remember, is an interface area between Northern Eurasia and Central Asia, but also politically is Kazakhstan. There we have a period of rule of one leader. Nursultan Nazarbayev is a continuing president in this republic, but very interestingly, the initial phase of regime consolidation under Nazarbayev, which ended about the end of 90s, beginning of 20s, actually he managed, staying there, to develop a new regime. And this the further stage of regime consolidation that have started with the elections of Nazarbayev, if I remember correctly, of '99, now is over. And actually now, also with the same president, Kazakhstan is entering already the third type of regime with a new set of constitutional changes proposed by Nazarbayev and so on and so forth. All these three regimes are characterized by fairly high degree of consolidation of political power. And from this point of view, they all can be called authoritarian regimes, or regimes close to authoritarian. But this would be probably too simplistic characteristic of those regimes, because the main issue in the agenda of all the three regimes in Kazakhstan was an issue of governability. The country is fairly big, country is fairly heterogeneous, it has to be managed even within Kazakh section of the population. There are divisions into three tribal groups that are entering rivalry, but there are also big Slavic population. There are sizable German minority. There's sizable Korean minority and some other minorities. So the situation is quite complicated there. And of course, there are social and political divisions, not so much political, rather social divisions in the country. So all this fairly heterogeneous structure has to be managed. So the governability was the first item in the agenda of all the three regimes. The point is that how this has been achieved. The first regime was relying more on personalistic nature of the rule. Nazarbayev himself, using his charismatic characters, using his personal influence and so forth, managed to consolidate regime, but it was fairly vulnerable in the sense that a lot depended on his personality. What he was trying to do during the second phase of regime consolidation, after elections of '99, he relied on what is termed in transitological literature as a managed democracy, or guided democracy, or directed democracy. Yes, he tried to imitate parties that would compete, to create somewhat broader power base that would rest also on introduction of some other actors into political life, but very controlled actors. He didn't want to let people destabilize the new people to come and to destabilize regime. He just wanted to develop a more pluralistic regime, a more pluralistic base for regime itself. It seems to me that at some stage it became evident for him that this wouldn't work, these formal structures wouldn't work, and this resulted actually in the crisis within his own family, with his son-in-law had to flee the country, and lots of other things happened. So this structure went into crisis. So what a new regime is being developed now, a regime which depends on, as I interpret it, of course it's not very clear, but it seems that at this stage Nazarbayev is trying to decentralize power on various levels of the governance, particularly to delegate more power to different structures within the to different territorial structures, to different functional structures, and so on and so forth. How successful he would be in doing so, it's very, very difficult to say, but it's quite evident that what we're observing now in Kazakhstan is the third phase of regime consolidation. And another thing which I want to say, that all these mutations, they definitely indicate that the priority of all the three regimes for maintaining a high level of governability is still there. It's still there. That's all for the time being, and we'll continue at our next class.